The U.S. government is about to spend $1.2 trillion on a new homeland missile defense system.
Yeah, the Golden Dome.
Right. They're calling it the Golden Dome. And the Congressional Budget Office just ran the numbers. And spreading that cost out over the next 20 years means this isn't just, a localized weapons contract.
No, not at all.
It's an industrial mobilization on the absolute scale of the Apollo program. But if you're trying to figure out where the real innovation is happening, looking at the massive household name defense contractors is actually a mistake.
Yeah, because the genuinely fascinating story is buried incredibly deep in the hidden layers of the tech stack.
Exactly.
It's basically the classic gold rush dynamic at a macroeconomic scale. I mean, the people who ultimately dictate the pace of a gold rush aren't the prospectors.
Right.
It's the people designing and selling the incredibly specialized, unreplicable pickaxes.
Which is exactly the mission for our deep dive today. We've pulled together a massive stack of sources for you to sift through this architecture.
And it's a really diverse stack, too.
Yeah, we are pulling from a deeply detailed Substack analysis written by a defense industry insider, granular financial research from Redeye, index updates from the NASDAQ, international market commentary out of Germany, and even a freshly signed bilateral geopolitical treaty from the White House.
It sounds like a disparate pile of documents, but when you map them all out, they point to an incredibly specific intersection.
They really do. The thesis we're going to explore with you today is how three massive tectonic macro trends, so the modernization of U.S. defense, the explosion of AI infrastructure capital expenditure, and the urgent push to reshore semiconductor manufacturing all violently collide in one relatively unknown Swedish microcap company called Sivers Semiconductors.
That's a wild convergence.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand why a tiny Swedish company is suddenly so critical, we first have to understand the sheer terrifying scale of that $1.2 trillion Golden Dome system.
Absolutely. And just to set the ground rules for you listening, our focus today is strictly on the hardware architecture and, the market forces at play here.
Right, we're just looking at the wiring.
Exactly. We're tracing the engineering and the supply chain mechanics impartially, rather than diving into the politics or taking any stance on the defense policies themselves.
Yeah, and the wiring of the Golden Dome isn't just a single missile. It's a highly complex 5-layer architecture.
5 distinct layers, yeah.
So layer 1 is your space-based sensors-like satellites constantly scanning the globe for heat signatures. Layer 2 is the glamorous part that gets all the media attention, which is the space-based interceptors.
Right, and the CBO estimates the military might build up to 700-800 of those.
Which is a staggering number. Then layer 3 is your ground-based interceptors, but the entire system lives or dies on layer 4, which is the AI battle management, and layer 5, the tactical communications.
Yeah, and the scale of the contracting is huge. The Missile Defense Agency has already approved 2,440 vendors under the contract vehicle for this, which they call SHIELD.
Wow, over 2,000 vendors.
Yeah, that vendor count is staggering, but you hit on the absolute linchpin of the whole operation. I mean, investors obsess over the interceptors because that's the kinetic part of the system.
It's the part that explodes.
Exactly. But layer 4 and layer 5 are the most vital components. You have an AI battle management system that has to make engagement decisions in milliseconds based on sensor data coming from thousands of miles away in low Earth orbit.
Right.
If an adversary manages to jam or sever those communication links, your multi-trillion-dollar swarm of interceptors is completely blind. The hardware is just useless.
It's like if the interceptors are the muscle of the operation, tactical communications is the central nervous system.
That's a great way to put it.
A bodybuilder can't throw a punch if their brain can't talk to their fist. The signal absolutely has to get through.
Which means the tactical communications backbone requires what the military calls make-before-break connectivity.
Make before break. What does that mean exactly?
So before a receiver loses the signal from one satellite passing rapidly overhead, it has to have already locked on to the next one. It requires simultaneous, unbreakable links.
Okay, which brings us to the physical hardware that actually does that.
Right.
Our Substack source points to a company called York Space Systems, which already has over $237 million in Golden Dome contracts. And in April 2026, York spent $355 million to acquire a company called Allspace.
Yeah, Allspace is the key player here.
Because they build something called the Hydra Max tactical terminal.
And the Hydra Max is a fundamental shift in how we communicate with space. Traditionally, a satellite dish is mechanical. It's a physical bowl that physically pivots to track a satellite across the sky.
Like the old satellite TV dishes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Mechanical dish is far too slow for low Earth orbit satellites moving at 17,000 miles an hour, and it can only look at one thing at a time.
Right, obviously.
The Hydra Max replaces that with an electronically steered array, or an ESA. It's a completely flat panel with zero moving parts.
Zero moving part.
None. But it can electronically steer radio beams to connect to multiple satellites simultaneously across low Earth, medium Earth, and geostationary orbits.
Wait, let's break that down for a second, because that sounds like magic. If it's a completely flat piece of metal or silicon and nothing physically moves, how on earth is it steering a radio beam to track a satellite flying across the sky?
It's all based on wave physics, specifically constructive and destructive interference. So imagine a grid of thousands of tiny individual antennas on that flat panel.
Okay, I'm picturing a grid.
If they all broadcast a radio wave at the exact same millisecond, the combined wave just goes straight up.
A little wall of sound.
Right. But if you delay the signal emission on the left side of the grid by just a fraction of a nanosecond compared to the right side, those waves overlap and push against each other.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they combine to form a single focused beam that shoots off at an angle.
So it's like dropping a line of pebbles into a pond. If you drop them all at once, the ripples just go straight out. But if you drop them in a rapid sequence from left to right, the overlapping ripples create a directional wave.
That is a brilliant way to visualize it. It's called phase shifting.
Phase shifting, got it.
But to perform that phase shifting calculation like delaying signals by picoseconds across a grid of tiny antennas while tracking multiple objects moving at orbital speeds, you need an unbelievable amount of specialized processing power directly on the panel.
Right, that math has to be instantaneous.
Exactly. Each Hydra Max terminal requires a grid of 1,500 to 2,000 highly specialized beamforming chips to do that math.
And here is the massive reveal from our industry sources. Sivers Semiconductors is the single source supplier for those specific beamforming chips.
The only supplier.
Yeah, when you multiply out the components, that comes to about $9,000 of Sivers hardware baked into every single all-space terminal.
What's fascinating here is the concept of economic lock-in, which operates completely differently in the defense sector than anywhere else. Well, if Allspace suddenly decided they wanted to replace Sivers with a cheaper chip maker, they can't just swap the part out like upgrading RAM in a laptop. Because of how integrated phase shifting is, changing the chip requires a ground-up redesign of the entire radio frequency front end.
Which means totally rebuilding the hardware architecture from scratch.
Yes. The industry standard timeline for that kind of redesign is 18 to 36 months.
Wow. 2 to 3 years just to change a chip.
Yeah, and it costs anywhere from $5 million to $20 million just to execute the engineering changes. But then you have to run the gauntlet of military requalification.
Right, the MIL-STD tests.
Exactly. You have to pass MIL-STD 810, which involves physically shaking the terminal to simulate launch vibrations, baking it, freezing it to prove it won't crack.
That sounds intense.
It is. Then there's MIL-STD 461, where they blast it with electromagnetic radiation to prove it can't be jammed.
Right.
Recertifying a new chip takes years. And since defense communication terminals typically have a 15 to 20-year life cycle, Allspace is effectively bolted to Sivers for decades.
Okay, but I have to stop you here. I'm looking at this from a national security perspective, and there is a glaring contradiction.
What's that?
The Golden Dome is a hypersensitive U.S. defense shield designed to protect the American homeland. How does a microcap company from Sweden become the single point of failure for the communication array?
It's a fair question.
Doesn't the Pentagon have incredibly strict rules about sourcing critical silicon from foreign entities?
They do, and it's one of the most rigorous auditing processes in the world. But this is where Sivers' specific corporate structure becomes their biggest asset. Sivers is what the semiconductor industry calls a fabless company.
Meaning they don't actually fabricate the chips themselves?
Correct. They design the architecture.
Wow.
The IP is developed by their engineers in Sweden and also in New York, which actually came from an acquisition they made.
Okay.
But they do not own the multi-billion-dollar factories that physically print the silicon. Sivers outsources the physical manufacturing to Global Foundries.
And Global Foundries operates heavily within the United States.
Specifically in Vermont and upstate New York. And more importantly, the Department of Defense has officially designated those specific Global Foundries facilities as trusted foundries.
Trusted foundries.
Yeah, it means the U.S. military has thoroughly vetted the physical supply chain, the employee clearances, the security protocols, From the moment the silicon is printed to the final packaging and testing, the chip never leaves the secure, domestic U.S. ecosystem.
So the U.S. gets the intellectual property of a European innovator, but the physical security of American manufacturing.
Exactly.
Which slots perfectly into the U.S. CHIPS Act. I mean, the whole point of the CHIPS Act is to aggressively reshore semiconductor manufacturing back to American soil.
Right.
Our sources highlight that Sivers just received a $6.6 million Year 2 funding extension from the Northeast Microelectronics Coalition Hub. That is CHIPS Act money.
And look at what that grant is actually funding. It's the EW STAR project, which focuses on full duplex arrays for electronic warfare.
Oh, wow.
And Sivers isn't doing this in a vacuum. They are partnered on this specific project with BAE Systems and the MIT Lincoln Laboratory.
That's huge. Receiving CHIPS Act funding alongside prime defense contractors is a massive stamp of government validation.
It gives them two completely distinct access points into the Golden Dome. They are coming in through the commercial side via the York Space and All-Space acquisition, and they are coming in through the front door of government R&D via CHIPS Act funding.
And if you zoom out to the broader geopolitical stage, the timing is almost unbelievable. Literally days ago, on May 22, 2026, the White House published a memorandum of understanding. The U.S. and Sweden signed a technology prosperity deal.
Yeah, that treaty formalizes bilateral cooperation on 5G, 6G, defense innovation, quantum computing, and AI.
It's like everything aligned at once.
Exactly. When you have the executive branches of both governments formally aligning their strategic technological interests, it vaporizes a lot of the bureaucratic friction. It provides a massive regulatory tailwind for a Swedish company trying to embed itself deeply into American infrastructure.
But the defense sector is just one side of the coin. Because if you can manipulate radio frequency waves at the micro level with that kind of precision, you can apply similar principles to light.
Right, photonics.
Which opens up an entirely different, incredibly lucrative market. According to Red Eye's Q4 financial research, Sivers has a distinct photonics division. And hardware sales in that specific division just skyrocketed by 144%.
It's a completely separate revenue engine. While the wireless division builds the beamforming chips for satellites, the photonics division is designing optical lasers and sensors for advanced autonomous systems and, crucially, AI data centers.
Let's touch on the autonomous systems first. The Red Eye report notes they have a major LiDAR customer, and industry analysts strongly suspect it's SIVE Technologies, who is preparing to ramp up mass production in the fourth quarter of 2026.
That's right around the corner.
Yeah, and if that single customer simply hits their projected volume targets, it could generate between $23 million and $58 million in cumulative revenue for Sivers by 2030.
That's substantial for a microcap.
But the data center application is where the physics get really interesting.
Our German market commentary source zeroes in on a major partnership Sivers has formed with Jabil, the massive American manufacturing services company.
Right.
Together, they're building optical transceiver modules for AI data centers.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The specific engineering choice they made here is fascinating. They designed these optical modules to completely skip the digital signal processors, or DSPs.
Yes, skipping the DSPs.
To understand why that's a game changer, you have to look at how data moves in a massive AI server farm right now. Currently, data travels between servers as light-like, photons moving through fiber optic cables.
Right.
But when that light hits a server, traditional architecture forces it to be converted into electricity electrons.
Which is terribly inefficient.
Yeah, the DSP processes those electrons, and then it has to convert the data back into photons to send it to the next server.
It's wildly inefficient. It's like taking a book written in English, translating it into French, and then immediately translating it back into English just so you can read the next paragraph.
And that translation process generates massive amounts of heat. Converting photons to electrons and back requires serious energy. By skipping the DSP entirely, Sivers and Jabil are keeping the data strictly in the optical domain.
It stays as light?
Exactly. This drastically cuts down the latency, but more importantly, it saves a tremendous amount of power in AI facilities that are currently facing a global energy starvation crisis.
They're essentially providing a cooling and efficiency mechanism at the hardware level, right when hyperscalers like Microsoft and Google are warning that they literally cannot secure enough electricity to power the next generation of AI models.
Okay, but I'm looking at the big picture here, and I have to throw a flag on the play.
Go ahead.
We are talking about a microcap company. They have a fraction of the headcount and budget of a traditional tech giant. Yet, they are trying to supply the central nervous system for a $1.2 trillion global defense shield, while simultaneously trying to solve the thermodynamic bottleneck of global AI data centers. Are they executing a brilliant diversification strategy, or are they spreading a tiny team dangerously thin across two completely different technological sandboxes?
You've just articulated the exact debate happening in the financial markets right now.
So it's a known concern.
Oh, absolutely. The narrative is spectacular. The engineering is highly validated. But when you look at the actual balance sheet, you see the brutal, unforgiving reality of trying to scale hardware manufacturing.
Yeah, the numbers in the Red Eye report are a stark reality check. Yes, Sivers saw a solid 17% growth on an FX-neutral basis, but their EBITDA, which measures their core operational profitability, was heavily negative.
Very negative.
They lost 20.1 million Swedish krona in the quarter.
Management attributes that loss to what they call EO items, exceptional or one-off costs.
Like what?
They specifically cited heavy restructuring, launching strategic initiatives, and dealing with a security breach.
And a security breach is the last thing you want to read in an earnings report, when the company's future relies on being a trusted vendor for the U.S. military.
Yeah, it's definitely a rough look.
Because they are burning through so much cash to scale operations, they recently had to go back to the markets and secure 125 million krona in fresh capital.
Though it's worth noting how they secured that capital.
Right.
Our German source points out that the new shares were priced at 14.50 krona.
Which is high, right?
Yeah, that isn't a desperation discount. That represents a 30% premium over the stock's recent average. Institutional investors like D&B and Storebrand are willing to pay a premium because they see the sheer size of the locked-in contracts on the horizon.
But retail investors are experiencing extreme whiplash.
Oh, totally.
If you read the sentiment on the German financial forums, the room is completely divided. Half the investors look at the negative cash flow, the security breach, and the constant need to raise capital, and they see a classic tech hype trap. They see a company that talks a big game but just burns money.
The other half, however, recognizes the valley of death in hardware manufacturing.
A valley of death.
Yeah, moving from a laboratory environment where you're building a few dozen brilliant project-based prototypes to a mass production environment where millions of units have to roll off a foundry line with perfect yield rates. That is the hardest chasm to cross in the industrial world.
It's notoriously difficult.
It requires a massive, painful outlay of capital to build the tooling and testing infrastructure before the revenue from mass production actually hits the books.
And you can see that confusion reflected in the major stock indexes. I mean, MSCI just announced they are deleting Sivers from their global small-cap index.
Right.
But in the exact same week, the NASDAQ OMX Stockholm Benchmark Index announced they are adding Sivers to their ranks starting June 1st.
This raises an important question, and it leads us to the most revealing corporate maneuver of the entire quarter. Sivers announced they were delaying the publication of their 2025 annual report to May 15th.
Which usually triggers panic. Delaying an annual report is almost always a sign that the auditors found something terrible in the books.
If it happens in a vacuum, yes, it's a massive red flag. But Sivers explicitly stated the reason for the delay. They are undergoing a rigorous PCAOB audit uplift.
The Public Company Accounting Oversight Board.
Exactly.
That is the absolute gold standard for auditing required to list on a U.S. stock exchange.
Precisely. They are ripping their Swedish accounting books apart and rebuilding them to comply with strict U.S. standards because they are evaluating a dual listing on the NASDAQ exchange in New York.
Wow.
And the operational headache of doing that is immense.
Because U.S. and European accounting systems treat revenue fundamentally differently, right?
True.
Especially with long-term contracts.
Exactly. Think about a 5-year defense contract. Under one set of rules, you might recognize a portion of that revenue every time you hit an engineering milestone.
Right.
Under the U.S. GAAP system, you might not be allowed to recognize that revenue until the physical hardware is actually delivered to the client.
That makes a huge difference on paper.
It does. Reconciling how you value your inventory, how you recognize revenue, and how you report your research and development costs across two entirely different continental financial systems takes armies of expensive auditors.
Yeah.
It is a massive drain on capital.
But it's the mandatory cover charge if you want access to the incredibly deep pools of U.S. institutional capital.
Absolutely.
So, to bring this all into focus for you listening, The ultimate takeaway from all these sources isn't just a stock pitch for a Swedish microcap. It's a masterclass in how to read the technological landscape.
Very true.
You don't always have to guess which trillion-dollar defense prime or which massive AI hyperscaler is going to win the decade. You just have to find the physical bottleneck they all rely on. Sivers Semiconductors has positioned itself as the literal and figurative beamforming chip connecting the massive power demands of AI data centers, the urgent modernization of the U.S. missile defense shield, and the geopolitical drive to reshore semiconductor manufacturing.
They have embedded their proprietary hardware at the absolute base layer of 3 generational infrastructure builds.
Yeah.
If they can survive the financial cash burn of crossing that chasm into mass production, the leverage they will hold is extraordinary.
But that leaves us with one final, slightly provocative thought to mull over based on where all these chess pieces are moving.
Okay, let's hear it.
Sivers is paying millions to upgrade its audits to PCAOB standards so they can list on the NASDAQ New York. They want access to American capital to fund this massive expansion. But consider their position. They are now the single-source supplier for the central nervous system of a $1.2 trillion U.S. defense shield.
Right.
And they are manufacturing critical, power-saving optical infrastructure for AI data centers. By cleaning up their books to U.S. standards, do they inadvertently paint a massive target on their own back?
That is a fascinating point. Once those books are completely U.S. compliant, transparent, and audited by the PCAOB, the financial risk of acquiring them drops to near zero for an American conglomerate.
Right. I mean, how long before a defense giant like York Space Systems or L3Harris or even an AI hardware giant just looks at the spreadsheet?
They'll definitely look at it.
They run the math and realize it is significantly cheaper to simply acquire the single-source supplier outright rather than paying them a premium for the next 20 years.
It's very likely.
Sivers is doing everything right to scale, but how long does a company like this actually survive as an independent European tech darling once the American giants realize how essential those pickaxes really are?
It is the ultimate paradox of success in the component business. If your technology becomes indispensable enough to a trillion-dollar architecture, eventually you just become part of the architecture yourself.
And that takes us right back to the beginning, the $1.2 trillion Golden Dome. An Apollo-scale mobilization where the most valuable real estate isn't the rocket itself, but the invisible, unjammable signals telling it where to go. Keep questioning the layers behind the headlines. Thanks for diving deep with us.